So thank you for joining us for our final edition of the spring WRAN webinar series, Allocating Water for Natural Areas, Natural Habitat. A few housekeeping things before we get going. Just a reminder, your phone lines are muted. Feel free to put any questions or problems you have in the chat box. We'll likely hold questions until the end. At the very, very end, I'll also open up the phone lines in case anybody wants to voice a question that way. So today we will be talking about the Governor's Water Augmentation Council with John Kmiec. The Governor's Water Augmentation Council investigates long-term water augmentation strategies, additional water conservation opportunities, funding, and infrastructure needs to help secure water supplies for Arizona's future. This committee is really critical in helping us make the most of every drop of water we have, which makes it easier for WRAN to then allocate to put some of that water towards natural areas. John Kmiec is the president of the Southern Arizona Water Users Association, the director of Marana Water, and he is also the chair for the Recycled Water Subcommittee on the Governor's Water Augmentation Council. So without anything further, I will hand it over to him.
Great, thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of information currently being shared at the Governor's Water Augmentation Council, and so hopefully I'm going to give you a lot of the items that were currently under discussion. We are in a discussion mode, so there's not a lot of actions have been made recently, but we are talking and we are discussing particularly what's going on with recycled water in the state and how we can make it more beneficial to all stakeholders involved, whether it's the water utilities, the environmental stakeholders, and anyone else in between. So without further ado, I'll get into my presentation here. Just a little background on myself. I was raised in Michigan, so I'm a transplant from the Great Lakes, Detroit area in particular. I moved to the Tucson area in 1999 to become a hydrologist with Tucson Water. I worked in environmental consulting in the Detroit area for several years before that. I have a bachelor's in geology and environmental geochemistry from Michigan State University, and a few years ago I received a master's in public administration. While at Tucson Water, I was over many of their recharge and recovery programs there, including the Sweetwater Wetlands and the Sweetwater Recharge Facility, as well as in 2002, I helped create the permit, wrote the permit application for what's called the Lower Santa Cruz River Managed Underground Storage Facility, also known as getting credit for the water in the Santa Cruz River. So I've been working in the recharge arena for many years now. I guess coming up on 20 years pretty soon. And in the last couple of years, the governor, when he created the Water Augmentation Council, asked me to be part of this, and then subsequently asked me to handle and chair and basically facilitate the Recycled Water Committee. So let's hop into it. I'm going to give you a background on what the council is currently doing, and then what the committee is doing, and then some of our discussion items that are actively taking place there. And then we can take questions at the end of the presentation. There we go. Okay, so the Water Augmentation Council is a creation of the Arizona Water Initiative that was created in December of 2015. And basically what the council was directed to do was to investigate, as Stephen actually read this earlier, investigate the long-term augmentation strategies for the state, but explore additional conservation opportunities, infrastructure, or report any policy direction or statutory changes for Arizona in the future. So the two items that were created out of that process is, one is called the planning area process, which is a process that ADWR is working on in 22 watershed planning areas across the state, examining them, understanding their hydrology, understanding the current needs or the current demands on those watersheds, and then what the future estimated demands would be on those watersheds. But then the other item that was created in the initiative was the Water Augmentation Council itself. So it's referred to as the GWAC or the GWAC, and this council membership consists of a variety of people, whether they're home builders, whether they're leaders in particular industries. Some are from mining, some are from ag, and then others are from utility or water managers across the state, as well as other statewide government officials or associations related to water management. It's about a 29-member council. Since it was created, and when you have a council that big of 29 members, some people come, some people go, but essentially it's a 29-member council, and the director of ADWR, Tom Bushotsky, is the chair of that council. So our principal direction is to, as a council, is to examine those issues based on the direction that we saw earlier, and then provide any direction to the director of ADWR on water management issues that we discover that we think need to be changed or identify as possible impediments to increasing water augmentation goals for the state or with regions within the state. So we also advocate for conservation, and like I mentioned, the augmentation opportunities also as a means to resolve water resource conflicts. And I put an underline under conflicts, resource conflicts, for a reason, because that's going to come into play directly with the Recycled Water Committee. Or improve water supply availability to ensure those legal certainty for users and investors. This is looking at the future as well as the current. So we want to make sure that people who may be deciding to invest in Arizona in some of our watershed planning areas, or some of our urban areas, or some of our rural areas, making sure that we as statewide stakeholders are meeting those needs and hopefully eliminating or mitigating any uncertainties that outside interests may have in investing in the state of Arizona. So while the council was meeting in predominantly in 2016, the decision was made at the time that there's 4 key areas that the director, Tom Bushotsky, and the council wanted to examine. And based on those 4 areas, the subcommittees were created. First subcommittee, and the one I'm going to focus on in a few minutes, is the Recycled Water Subcommittee. That committee is well, I'm going to get to it in a second. So we have the Recycled Water Committee. We also have a Desalination Committee. The Desalination Committee was originally looking at any desalination opportunities or impaired waters within the state that may be non-potable to drink. The current focus of that committee, just to throw it in there, is they're looking at intrastate water basins that are not suitable for drinking water, but would they be suitable under a desalination scheme, and could that water be captured and used in a productive manner in the state of Arizona? So it's an interesting committee with that. The other one is a Long-Term Augmentation Committee. That is looking at long-term strategies. Essentially, if there's any major projects that fall out of the Recycled Water Committee or the Desalination Committee, long-term augmentation and long-term strategizing on how to bring a project to fruition is the focus of that committee. And then lastly is finance. If there's a statewide project like the recapture of a briny aquifer and converting it to a usable water system, what are the financial implications? What mechanism could be recommended to the director of ADWR that may then recommend those alternatives to the governor and the legislature to figure out a mechanism to pay for such projects? Any project that we do intrastate would obviously most likely be funded within the state. When the CAP canal was built many years ago, that was with a lot of federal assistance and a lot of federal borrowing. Any intrastate augmentation strategy or program that we find within the state that we wish to go down to would obviously have to be funded intrastate. And so what mechanisms are available for future governors or future legislative bodies to consider for any of these projects to be brought to fruition. So, okay, hopping back to the Recycled Water Committee. So our goal essentially is to discuss how do we augment through reuse and reclaimed or poor quality water and reduce future demand and supply imbalances. That is essentially what the Reclaimed Water program was always intended to do. That's been created for the state of Arizona. So the main role of our committee is to look at that. Is the reclaimed water rules or the way reclaimed water has been developed, is it being utilized to its maximum benefit? Are we in a limbo? Is there statutory or legislative changes that could assist communities in reusing their water more effectively? Are there any impediments out there? These are all questions that we're throwing out there. So with that, so there's been 4 main topics this year that we've been talking about related to the Recycled Water Committee. The first one is direct potable reuse. And direct potable reuse, for those that don't know, is currently prohibited in the state of Arizona. What that means is taking reclaimed water or treated wastewater and converting it directly into a drinking water source. Right now you cannot do that in the state of Arizona. In many other states you can, and those rules are changing. It seems like by the month and across the country. With the increasing technologies that are available to treat water, taking a water supply after it's been treated, convert it into a clean quality reclaimed water, but then doing a more advanced treatment on that water to take it to above and beyond potable drinking water standards is something that can be done. So from an augmentation strategy perspective for a drinking water utility, direct potable reuse is probably not that far off on the horizon. But the first thing that needs to occur for any community long-range planning and water management is to remove that prohibition. Nobody's currently doing advanced studies within the state that I'm aware of on a direct potable reuse scheme for their community because that prohibition's there. ADEQ, though, is in the process of removing that prohibition and making it wide open and putting the rules in place so at least communities can start thinking about repurposing their water, particularly in an area if the water supply is stressed from lack of availability to get a local water supply, if there's a drought situation happening in a particular area. Direct potable reuse might be the solution. It has been the solution in New Mexico, Texas. It's actively being pursued and demonstrated in California, as well as other places are considering it. Oklahoma is another state that's considering it as well. So there's a lot of movement on that front. From our committee perspective, we're making a current recommendation that ADEQ continues to move down that path to make direct potable reuse a potential option by removing the prohibition. So another topic that we have is the statutory review of the 2025 sunset clause. When the Groundwater Management Act and then the subsequent underground storage facilities and managed recharge and constructed recharge programs came to be in the 90s, the use of using recycled water, reclaimed water, as well as the use of remediated groundwater from either a Superfund site or a WRF site, which is an interstate or intrastate declared cleanup site. The use of that water and the conversion of that water so it doesn't offset a community's renewable resource supply sunsets in 2025, which we deem it shouldn't have a sunset. If a community is using recycled water, they should be able to get credit for that water. Or if a community is pumping remediated groundwater because the groundwater is currently contaminated, they should be allowed to have the credit for that water. It should not debit against their resource portfolio, especially in the remediated water situation, as well as the recycled water being able to be converted to long-term storage credits for a community's assured water supply that should not sunset as well, and communities should be continuously encouraged to have a recycled water strategy without penalty. But there's a 2025 sunset clause on each of those items, and our recommendation so far from what's been discussed, our draft recommendations, is that 2025 sunset clause probably just needs to be removed, and communities should continue to do their water management strategies around getting beneficial use from those waters, whether it's recycled water or remediated groundwater. The third item, and this is more of a public perception item. We find, as water managers, we find in the state of Arizona and actually around the country, the term effluent is not understood by the public. We've geared our rules, we've geared our statutes to treated wastewater or recycled wastewater, giving it the term effluent, which is a very engineering type term, the name for that water. Well, when you talk to the general public about, hey, we wish to recycle our effluent, we wish to do this, many cases they have a blank stare because they don't know what the term effluent is. There's been a lot of public perception focus groups nationally, predominantly through the Water Reuse Association, where in those focus groups, if you convert the name effluent to recycled water, the general public can follow what the water managers and the stakeholders who are dealing with water are saying much easier. And they understand what you're describing to them. Once you drop that term effluent, that recycled water name is way more accepted publicly because they have a general understanding of exactly what you're talking about. So in Arizona, we use the term effluent all the time. Within our industry, we throw it around all the time, and I can agree with what those focus groups have said. I can talk to my friends, I can talk to my neighbors, and I start throwing around the term effluent, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. I've changed my vocabulary to recycled water from the wastewater plant, and they're fully on board and they can follow the conversation. So we're looking at what the potential strategy would be to change those terms. It doesn't necessarily augment supplies, which is part of our goal in the council, but it does clarify what we're talking about and would make it easier for the general public to understand what water managers are talking about, hopefully in the future. And then the last item, and this is the item we're going to get into a little more in depth here, and because this is the one of interest, and this is the one that I identified as a potential conflict in within the state, and that is the managed recharge program. And I have why 50%, and I'll describe that here in a second. So what is managed in-channel recharge? Basically, this recharge program was created to allow water owners who were discharging their recycled water, I'm not going to say effluent, I'm going to try not to, I'm sure I'll get caught a couple times in this, to recycle their recycled water into the environment. If it's going into the environment and it's in a monitored situation, and it can be determined through the permitting process that there's infiltration back to the aquifer, you can work with the state Department of Water Resources, and they will give you a form of credit on your groundwater withdrawal balance sheet for returning that water back to the aquifer. So the other important thing about managed in-channel recharge is it's done naturally. It's without the construction of any dams or weirs or infiltration basins, anything that's constructed. This is the natural passive back to the environment. There will be a level of credit that will be given back to you if you can demonstrate those items. Conversely, what is constructed recharge? Now, a constructed facility allows for that water to be stored in the aquifer using some type of engineered mechanism. In many cases, particularly in southern Arizona, and that'll probably, I'm going to reference southern Arizona more so in this talk because that's where I'm at, is it's done through basins. It's done through aquifer recharge facilities, and I have the picture here of the City of Tucson Sweetwater Recharge Facility and the Sweetwater wetlands associated with that. So those constructed engineer basins, if you put your recycled water in those basins, you get near 100% credit because you can demonstrate through those engineered controls that the water that you're putting in there, minus evaporation and whatnot, the rest of it can be credited as you recharging the aquifer directly. Unlike the managed recharge project or managed program, even though you may know that the majority of that water, there's some that's consumed by the environment, but the majority of it is infiltrating into the riverbed and supplying the same exact aquifer, you only get 50% credit. And this is where we see future conflicts down the road. What the current rules are basically forcing water resource managers to think about is as the value of water increases with time in any community, under the current statutes, it's going to drive most municipalities or water companies to remove their water from the environment, remove the natural benefit they may be providing for riparian habitat, for environmental stakeholders, Audubon Arizona members, as well as the general community, and force it to go into a constructed recharge basin, which there's no real environmental benefit other than the direct replenishment of the aquifer. Because if you're losing 50% on one end and your community needs to have that water storage protection, and given the cost of water goes up every year, going to 100% is a strategy that many are looking at. And this is kind of what I'm talking about right here, the value of water. As that value of water continues to change over time, that map on the bottom left, that's the Sweetwater Recharge Facility. Looking at that, where the City of Tucson and other stakeholders release their water to the Santa Cruz River, we're only getting 50% of what ends up recharging in that river. However, if we take that same exact drop of water and put it in the purple area in the recharge facilities, we get double the credit. But at the end of the day, which one do we want? Which one do we think is most beneficial for the citizens of the state of Arizona? A riparian habitat and a natural water course, or an engineered barbed wire fence recharge facility? Well, under the current rules, the barbed wire fence recharge facility has twice the benefit than leaving it in a natural course. So we want to, is there an opportunity through this council to eliminate that potential conflict by being able to demonstrate that if the same water is ending up in the same aquifer but producing multiple other benefits, should the 50% rule or the 50% cut to the aquifer be re-examined in state rule to not encourage people to pull it out of the natural river courses, but to encourage people to leave it in those areas as long as they can demonstrate that that water is getting to the aquifer like it would be in a constructed scenario. The other conflict is repurposing altogether, and not just repurposing between a managed recharge facility and a constructed recharge facility. Potential conflicts, one example is there's a lot of water in the Tucson area that is still released to the Santa Cruz River from many stakeholders, whether it's Tucson, Marana, Metro Water, Oro Valley, Kmiec County, the Bureau of Reclamation, others. If somebody wants to, if somebody has a higher value, let's say a business, and in Flagstaff they have a paper mill. If a paper mill moved into the Tucson area and needed to have 5,000 or 10,000 acre feet of recycled water to do their processing, and they're going to have an overall economic impact of hundreds of millions of dollars to the community through employment and through just general economic activity, is it going to drive those water owners to if I'm only getting 50% by putting it in the river, but I can get 100% by delivering it to a manufacturing operation and get paid cash for it without having to deplete any of our other water supplies like groundwater in the area that we're using for drinking water purposes, which one ends up being more advantageous? Well, as long as the managed recharge program is penalizing people with a 50% cut, then the economic benefits of repurposing that water someplace else is always going to be high on the list for people to pull it out of any river or any riparian habitat and use it for another purpose. Those are the potential conflicts you could have for repurposing reclaimed water. Under a 100% credit scenario for managed recharge, that ends up being a tougher decision for a water manager or a mayor and council or a community to think about. If the water is essentially providing the same wet water benefit at the same credit level, maybe the economic benefit doesn't outweigh the natural benefit that the riparian habitat within the community is providing. And it puts it on a more level playing field than it's currently at right now. And hopefully, within our subcommittee, is there a win-win? Is there a way that we can balance those needs of what water managers need to do with the water, as well as what the community wants from a natural perspective or a natural riparian perspective, a habitat perspective, having within their community. Hopefully, within our subcommittee and within the council, we can discover some of those items, which will at least minimize any of those potential conflicts as the value of water increases over time. So recently, our last Recycled Water Committee meeting, we focused a lot on managed recharge. You know, why is it a 50% cut? How did it come to be there? So we had 5 really good talks on how the managed recharge program either benefits or affects or is a limited benefit for several stakeholders. And this meeting, I believe, took place on March 29th, just several weeks ago. And then what we had Jerry Walker, who's the Assistant Director of ADWR. She gave a history lesson on the managed recharge program, how it got developed in the 1990s, and what were some of the underlying discussion items at that time going through the ADWR archives and the stakeholders who were present at that time on how 50% got agreed to. Well, what it seems like is from, you know, just to give her history lesson and some it sounds like there was arguments for 0, where people should get no credit for discharging to a natural waterway, which sounds odd, and then all the way to 100%, treating it same as a constructed facility. And it sounds like the 50% cut was actually a political mediated, we're just going to split the baby down the middle type of scenario for managed recharge. What they didn't like at the time for the managed recharge project or program was that it was, because I'm sure it was a lot of engineers, and there was a lot of stakeholders that were engineers, not to bash on engineers, but the way they were thinking about it was in numbers and in volumes and how to create this recharge program. By doing managed recharge in a river course to replenish an aquifer, they want to make sure that the drops that go in, minus evapotranspiration of what the vegetation is, and the drops that leave pass measuring points. You have a measuring point at the front end of a facility. In the case of the Santa Cruz, at the front end of a facility, you have a measuring point, as well as the flow rates that are coming from the 2 regional wastewater treatment facilities. And then at the end of the project, you have a USGS stream gauge at Trico Road, just before the Santa Cruz leaves the Pima County and enters Pinal County. And the measurement of the difference of the flow rates every day from what goes in minus what goes out, minus the evapotranspiration and other factors, then you end up with a recharge credit of what actually infiltrated in the river. So it's not just drop it in the river, let it go, and whatever you drop in the river you get. There are deductions that'll take place, and I'll hit that a little more here in a second. So she talked about the history. So because those are a managed recharge project is, by all its variables, once you release water to nature, there is a lot of variables out there where that water could get moved. That water, can be, depending on vegetation growth, can be changed. The evapotranspiration rate factor could change over time. So the advantage was always given to constructed recharge, because a constructed recharge, you have when in the case of recharge basins, and also in the case of injection wells where you directly inject the water into the aquifer, you have a known quantity and you put it in. There's limited evaporation losses. It's measured for the area that you're in, and they give you 100% credit because you can more easily count for that water that's going in and out of the project. So the history lesson here was the 50% seemed to be an agreed value, but it was a value that at the time wanted to drive people to constructed engineered facility and giving them that incentive to create those facilities. After that, we had Tim Tomier from Tucson Water, as well as Joe Olson from Metro Water. They talked about what the managed recharge project means to southern Arizona as using the Santa Cruz River, and I'll get into a couple of their slides and then demonstrate how it affects it and how water managers in southern Arizona are looking at this. Then we had a great presentation from the Northern Arizona Municipal Water Users Association, and it was Mr. John Munderloh from Prescott Valley. They did a constructed project in the channel. Just to remember, manage means you leave it natural. You can make it a constructed project that ADWR can increase your infiltration credits for by doing certain engineering controls. And in Prescott Valley, they tried to do that, spent a lot of money, spent a lot of capital, have to do a lot of operations and maintenance, and they only ended up with a 65%, if I remember correctly, a 65% credit for the water that they put in their facility, that they have to spend a lot of their ratepayers' money to continually maintain these berms and these stop basins within the river course that they use in Prescott Valley, and they only get a 15% benefit from the water they put in that project. Next, we had Sonia from Audubon, Arizona, and she gave a fantastic presentation on the value of this water and what it means to the communities across Arizona, and whether they're the 46 important birding areas that are assisted by recycled water augmentation in those courses. She also talked about the economic development that's obviously tied to water resources and habitat within Arizona. As you can imagine, especially in the Sonoran Desert areas, when you create habitat that was lost from over pumping of groundwater over the last 100 years, and you can restore that with a natural flow back in these river courses like the Santa Cruz, there is an economic benefit. People do enjoy these riparian areas. She also talked about that there is no such thing as wastewater in Arizona. Even if you're releasing the water to environment, it is a benefit for the community and for the state and for the habitat at which it serves. So that was an excellent presentation from Sonia. And then lastly, we had a presentation from the Bureau of Reclamation, Mr. Lawrence Marquez. The Bureau of Reclamation actually owns a lot of the recycled water in the state, particularly in southern Arizona, based on Indian rights settlements that have occurred in the past 20 and 30 years, notably the SAWARSA, or Southern Arizona Water Rights Settlement Act, of down here in Kmiec County, which the first 28,200 acre feet of water that's produced at the regional wastewater facilities in Kmiec County belongs to the federal government in trust for the local tribes to be able to use. So as it's currently used right now, that first 28,200 acre feet of water that gets carved from the top of the pool belongs to the government and belongs to the Indians And are the Indians receiving full benefit for that water that they're leaving in the Santa Cruz, when under a managed recharge scenario, they are only getting 50% of the credit that goes in? So there's even concern at the federal level of how the rules are written in the state of Arizona that it's pushing the federal government to come up with a constructed recharge option where they would pull all that water or a portion of that water out of the Santa Cruz River and divert it to a constructed project under the current scenario based on the value of water and what they see the value of water being in the future. So it was a great presentation by the Bureau of Rec and how they're looking at exactly the same items that other resource managers in state are seeing as well. So just to show you how a drop of water gets treated, this is a slide from the Metro Water presentation. Metro Water, they have their water going to actually most of it goes to the Tres Rios plant at Pima County, formerly the Ina Road plant. So in 2016, they had 4,246 acre feet go into the river. As I mentioned, then you have the contributions that Metro has to make to the federal government for the Indian Rights Settlement. So now they're down, as well as what's called the Conservation Effluent Pool, which is a city of Tucson and Pima County, holding water for holding effluent for future projects. So their 4246 now goes to 2045. Then you get into the managed recharge projects where it's flowing through the Santa Cruz River, and you take off evapotranspiration losses to meet the needs of the riparian habitat. The effluent that was, or sorry, recycled water. I'm saying effluent. I should be. It's on the screen. I shouldn't be saying that. The recycled water, now their ownership is down to 1174. And then the very last thing, instead of having 1,174 credits, acre feet of credit, by putting it in the river, they get this arbitrary cut of 50%. So they only earn for their resource portfolio 587 acre feet. They started with 4,246 after the agreements, after the evapotranspiration, after the 50% cut to the aquifer, 587. So between the last two, the 50% cut to the aquifer at 587, and then what would be 100% would be 1174. As the value of water increases for the Metro Water customers, they can double that by pulling their water out of the channel and putting it into a constructed scenario or directly delivering it to agriculture and have the benefit of twice the amount at 1,174 acre feet. Like I mentioned, as the value of water continues to increase and change, this is what water resource managers, particularly in the active management areas, are having to deal with. They don't want to pull their water out of the river. They know what the benefit is by leaving the water in the river to the regional economy and the riparian environment of the Santa Cruz River. But when push comes to shove, Metro, Marana, Tucson Water, we have a responsibility to our current ratepayers and our future ratepayers of getting the maximum beneficial use of the water that they've developed. So it was a great presentation from Joe. Let me see here. There we go. Another project that you may have heard about was then presented by Tim Tomier, the director of Tucson Water, and that is a new concept that the city of Tucson is looking at called Agua Dulce, and it is the concept of bringing water back to the downtown area of Tucson to develop a riparian habitat downtown. Currently, the perennial river supported by the recycled water of the community begins near Prince Road at the Agua Nueva plant, and then at Ina Road or the Tres Rios plant all the way to the county line, and in the Pinal County is where you have your perennial recycled water flows in the community. So it's several miles north of downtown Tucson. Downtown Tucson, the Santa Cruz River is dry unless it's monsoon season or a storm event comes through. But like San Antonio, like some of these other cities, having a downtown river is a tremendous public amenity and a natural amenity for the community. So Tucson Water is playing with this concept of bringing some of their recycled water to downtown Tucson and developing this habitat. What makes this habitat pencil out for them is if they can get 100% credit for that water that they are moving out of their reclaimed water program to reestablish habitat downtown. They have existing reclaim lines all around Cushing Street, Congress Street, where an outfall to the river can be diverted right from the reclaimed water system into the community. They're willing, or they think they would like to put up to 2,500 acre feet a year into a natural part of the Santa Cruz to develop re-established riparian habitat downtown. They can carve that off the reclaim system. Can't really see it. Hopefully they come up with better maps in the future, but having that perennial flow going from Cushing Street downtown past the convention center, past Congress Street in the downtown area, and creating that habitat is the goal. So this is what it looks like. I think this is looking north from Cushing Street on the bridge over the Santa Cruz River. Doesn't look very appealing. It just doesn't look appealing at all. What they're hoping to do is establish that 2,000 or 2,500 acre feet back downtown and reestablish a nice riparian corridor in the downtown area. So their benefits that they see is they can put all the city's reclaimed water to a beneficial use. And their beneficial use is not only for customers on the reclaimed water system, but the natural beneficial use to the area by reestablishing environmental riparian zones, creating those flows, and then hopefully one other concept, because a lot of the western side of the Santa Cruz River downtown is yet to be developed, would be creating an engineered channel through the new development areas on the west bank of the Santa Cruz River to create a river walk type scenario between those businesses and those shops before that water eventually dumps into the Santa Cruz River to establish the native vegetation and native habitat. So they're trying to make sure that, you know, if we want the best value for this water, you can associate an economic driver with it, as well as have that win-win solution of creating that riparian habitat. And a lot of their capital infrastructure is already in place for these things to occur. So Tucson's concern is what I alluded to earlier. You have a cut to the aquifer system. We know, after doing decades of managed recharge, we know that in these managed recharge projects, the water is effectively getting back to the aquifer, the same as it would in a constructed aquifer scenario. But that 50% cut to those managed projects is making water resource managers think twice under the current rules, forces those constructed projects, and all those constructed projects, all it does is pass on higher costs to the rate-paying customers or the community by having to build those capital infrastructure projects, having to maintain them, having to pull the weeds out, and having to protect them, as opposed to just releasing that water to the environment. Like I shown earlier, if it's in the red, it gets a 50% cut. If it's in the purple, it gets nearly 100% credit. Is that the issue that we want to address in the Recycled Water Committee? So far, it is. So where we're at now, we haven't had a meeting since March 29th. We are going to be talking this Monday coming up is the next Recycled Water meeting at ADWR downtown at 10 a.m. to noon, and we're going to be going over those 4 recommended areas to focus on for this year's report. The direct portable reuse one has been well established, and that's actually moving along with the ADEQ right now. But addressing that statutory review on the sunset clause, which is, there shouldn't be a lot of discussion on that. That seems to have universal appeal removing that barrier, as well as the changing the terminology. But then the one that we'll probably spend most of the time this upcoming Monday is managed recharge. This is the biggest effect on water resource planning for the state of Arizona. Why is managed recharge still at 50%? Are we at a time of maturation with the state's aquifer recharge program where we know that 50% compared to 100% is going to be a conflict in many communities? And if it's benefiting the same aquifer with the same type of recharge, and you can demonstrate that it is between constructed and managed, should the 50% cut need to be re-examined and go away? So that's going to be largely our discussion this upcoming week, like I said, Monday. And if anybody wants to listen in, ADWR does broadcast those meetings online, or if you're in the downtown Phoenix area and you want to stop in and be in the audience, you're going to be able to hear and listen to the stakeholders at the table, the members of the council and the members of the invited members of the Recycled Water Committee having these further discussions on these topics. Just want to also add in that AMWA, which is the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association, which covers many of the jurisdictions in the municipal water and wastewater in the Phoenix area. They've recently released a paper covering most of these topics that I have listed here and their thoughts on it. That actually is part of the materials that will be pushed out to the committee members this week to review, and they're present on the committee as well. So that's a lot of good information that when you see the meeting packet, if you want to read what the Phoenix area cities are, what they think about these items, that paper is out there, and we'll be discussing the same elements from that paper related to these topics on Monday morning. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I guess we have, I'll throw it back to you, Steve, if you want to facilitate any general questions before we move on.
Good deal. Thanks so much. I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm really excited to see managed recharge coming up both in GWAC and through AMWA's recent paper. Kind of seems like an incentive pulling water directly away from natural habitats, which is of course something that WRAN is going to be at least watching intently. So with that, if we have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat box, and we'll take them as they come. After that, I'll open up the phone lines in case anyone wants to voice a question verbally. So I'll just give you a couple minutes now. While we wait, I did have one question, John, if I could.
Yes.
You mentioned direct potable reuse is currently prohibited in Arizona. But we've been following closely and having conversations with Water Now, and specifically around their project. I think it was the winner for the last Arizona Prize, and what they're doing is they are having a truck go around that's kind of a mobile water treatment facility, and they're going to be delivering that treated water to breweries, and then having sort of a large-scale contest about who can brew the best, sticking with your terminology changes, recycled water-based beer. Any idea how that's all going down with that prohibition in place?
Yes, I'm actually one of the principal scientists on that project. So yeah, thanks for bringing it up. That's a great plug. Yeah, so what ADEQ is doing right now is they're essentially they're doing an interim lift on the prohibition because of that project. So they're going to be doing detailed DPR prohibition removal and replacement in the reclaimed water rules that are currently open. So there's actually some stakeholder groups helping ADEQ right now draft permanent rule language. But just recently, DEQ said if you create an advanced water treatment process using reclaimed water Class A+ or Class B+, and permit it with, I think, an individual permit through DEQ, they're allowing it to happen now. So this prohibition is actively going away. It's in an interim rule right now to allow for this. It's the Arizona Community Foundation Prize for the Water Innovation Challenge, which is the mobile direct potable reuse plan that will go around the state, Flagstaff, Phoenix, and Tucson in particular over the next couple months, and then be available for other communities after that. It's allowing that project to continue because ADEQ is a supporter of that project. So we're doing that project under the interim rule revision, but there will be permanent rule revision eliminating that prohibition on direct photo reuse coming out very, very soon in the next several months.
Very cool. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look like we have any other. Oh, there we've got one. From Sarah Luna, does the committee plan to make specific recommendations, and what is the time frame? And I think that's referring to the managed recharge questions. Any changes in that? Yeah,
that's the, I have to facilitate that committee, and in that March meeting is we predominantly had those 5 stakeholders, you know, whether it was ADWR, Southern Arizona, Northern Arizona, Audubon, Arizona, and the Bureau of Rec give those presentations, but those presentations went the whole 2-hour allotted time frame. So we were very limited discussion once we got to the end of the presentation. So this meeting on Monday is without presentations. It's going to be a discussion, and during that discussion, my hopes is, as I facilitate among the stakeholders around the room in the committee and members of the council that are present that day, is that we start to drive towards having a detailed, specific recommendation that'll end up at the council and future councils, and then hopefully be an accepted recommendation by the director of ADWR. So that's kind of the process as I understand it, how it will be moving forward. So we're still in a deliberative phase at the committee level.
Okay, thank you. We don't have any others rolling in just yet, so I guess I do have one more as long as the floor is open. We know that managed recharge, not all recharge efforts are created equal in terms of how much water actually infiltrates back into the aquifer. Do you have any examples of managed recharge efforts where sort of a comparable amount of water is being recharged in comparison to a construction recharge project? I'm thinking specifically the Santa Cruz with all of the water quality improvements that have been seen out of the plants along its course.
Yeah, well, with respect to the Santa Cruz, the regional providers that are part of the Lower Santa Cruz Managed Recharge Facility are getting more credit because there's less water passing the USGS stream gauge at Trico Road. So the benefits of the new plant are providing more credits, but it's still the 50% cut. In the past, when you're subtracting what leaves the region and leaves the end of your project end, it was substantial. I think it was traveling at certain times 7 to 10 miles past the last stream gauge. So there was a lot of water not infiltrating. But with those recent improvements over the last several years, the removal of nitrogen, which then takes away the schmutzdecke at the bottom of the Santa Cruz River, you have a more natural-looking, clean river. That water is infiltrating, less water. And many times right now, water is not even making it to the Trico stream gauge, so there's no deduction for water that's lost from the project.
But there's still the 50% deduction overall.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Cool. It doesn't look like there's any more coming through the chat box, so I'm going to open up the phone line real quick and see if anybody comes through there. Let's see. All right, everyone, you're unmuted if you want to chime in. And the feedback begins. Anybody out there want to add anything, any questions? Guess not. Let me shut you guys back down. All right, well then I think that wraps it up for today. Thanks for joining us, John. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. We look forward to hearing more. deal. Thanks, everyone.